welcome to our second episode of Get Hydrated, a podcast about the people of healthcare. I am your host, Brandon Plafka, founder of Hydra BPM, an AI-driven software for optimizing patient workflow and healthcare operations by transforming data analytics into decisive action. Yesterday, we aired the story of Deshaun Morris, a 3-year-old boy who, by what some might describe as a victim of our healthcare system, others may say he was an unintended consequence. Many others would say he was a result of greedy insurance companies. The reality is there's no easy answer or solution to a heartbreaking situation. Our guest today actually going to take us a little closer to the front line and provide us some additional insight into the daily challenges in post-acute care and perspective on what was obviously an impactful story in Deshaun Morris. He's an intelligent, influential leader with a Texas home health organization. And in the last few years, he's transitioned from the tech industry into healthcare. Initially, he was in pediatric therapy, and now more recently has gone into the nursing side. And I know that his energetic and business-savvy approach has what led to some of his successes in this transition. One of those which has resulted in 150% year-over-year revenue growth at his previous company, all while reinvigorating a culture. Please welcome Jacob Johnson. Jacob, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
Absolutely. So Jacob, as a follow-up from, as I said, the episode yesterday on Deshaun, with you being there in the Texas market, could you just share with us a little more of the tone and conversations that are still occurring from a story that just released last month?
Yeah, so there's basically two sides to it down here. There is the provider side that see this as a complete tragedy, something that was completely avoidable. And then there's the other side, the health plan side, that sees this as just kind of a consequence that happened, doesn't want to take responsibility of it, and would prefer to keep the status quo as opposed to making any kind of real changes.
Okay. At this point in the situation, what would you say seems to be the more majority vote, do you feel like?
I feel like right now it's preservation of the status quo. I mean, I actually watched a good chunk of the 6.5-hour hearing where the CEO and CMO of the health plan that was responsible for Deshaun actually spoke in front of a hearing, I guess, with a committee of the Texas Senate. And it was very disheartening to hear two very savvy businessmen talk circles around a bunch of semi-clueless politicians.
Okay. And when you say talk circles around, do you mean it more from a perspective of that they are just so much more knowledgeable and a deep understanding of what it really takes to run a healthcare plan, or more so there was a malicious intent behind it and that they were just there to, as described it, preservation of the status quo?
Yeah, I don't think, I think malicious is a strong word. I wouldn't ascribe that to them. I would say that with their more in-depth knowledge of the terminology, how the regulations work, which is surprising considering they're on the business side versus the politicians, I do think that, sorry, go ahead.
No, it was a funny comment. You got a little chuckle out of me.
Yeah. You'd think that the government would know more about their own regulations, but that's unfortunately not the case. And it's sad that that's unfortunate, but I think that they are completely on the side of wanting to maintain the status quo, and just their overall business acumen and knowledge of the industry and how to keep things the same. I mean, you could just see that all over the hearing.
Right. Yeah. And, one thing that I noticed, and it's not, I didn't see the hearing, but in reading the story and obviously talking about it yesterday, the approach with the mother, Linda, in that, the director there was Superior, his version of maintaining the status quo was to, I think, offer what they described as a soft splint, right, to prevent Deshaun from removing the trach. And, I think that's a clear-cut example of, as you describe it, right, that ability to keep the status quo and protect themselves in such a way, saying we made an offer, but also as a parent and person in the day-to-day life of that child, that doesn't feel like a realistic solution. And so it's kind of the meeting of two evil heads there in such a way that they have very, very different objectives. And I'm not saying either one of them is necessarily wrong or right for having their own perspective on it, which they should have, but it's just a very challenging situation that their best interests in that situation are so incredibly different that creates this dynamic.
I agree. And I mean, you zoom out a couple levels and look at the actual population, and let's say that this decision is made a couple thousand times throughout the state, and it becomes a little bit more of just one impact to one family, and then you get an entire almost abandonment of these medically fragile children, the percentage of which is increasing. If you look at the statistics, I believe the percentage of children born with disability has almost tripled over the past 15 or 20 years.
Yeah. And it's that dynamic specifically to Texas too. So to your one point, you have an ever increasing population that needs this type of care. And then you have a transition to a managed care system that quite frankly is just an entirely different model in the approach to care, right? There's this very soft, technically it would be hard because it's written, but it's written so generally that there's this commitment from a company like Superior and other payers in the area to say, here's what we will do in exchange for this fee. And then the interpretation of what those deliverables are so generic and so broad that you can offer a soft splint to a child who ends up brain dead, essentially.
Yep.
So don't want to put you on the spot here, but I'm going to a little bit, kind of narrowing down to your specific experience in the industry, even, your own personal preservation in this whole idea of the industry that you're in now. What is your personal take on this story, this situation, and that you're kind of living it every day? Obviously not the exact Ashawn story, but you can certainly relate to it because I'm sure many of the patients there that you have in your demographic probably have very similar conditions and diagnoses and dealing with a similar situation.
Yeah. My personal take is that I think the system is geared towards denials, not approvals. And it's also focused on increasing the administrative burden of maintaining a bigger census, the end result of which is patients not getting care that they really need. I think that you take pediatric therapy, for example, which is how I first got into healthcare. It's a 13-step workflow just to get a kiddo from a referral to a start of care. To get their first treatment on there, it takes 13 steps to do that. And the average timeline of that is anywhere from, with a very savvy company and small company, 30 days minimum. And you look at these larger ones that are large for a reason because they're doing something right, and it goes up to 45 and sometimes 60 days. And to me, that's just completely unacceptable. I mean, these are children below the age of 21, a lot of whom are born with these birth defects and disabilities that are not able to get the care until 2 months after getting referred to a specialist. That's ridiculous.
Jacob, I think it's interesting to hear you say that you talk about the system that is obviously, you think, biased towards denials versus authorizations. And I think a key point to the audience and something important to say is that Jacob by no means is of a clinical background. He's an individual who has, as I described in his intro, a business background, what I know to be a smart, intelligent leader. Grew his growth at his previous company was top line revenue. So it's not as though he was somehow cutting operating expenses or doing different things in order to take that 150% to the bottom line. That 150% was at the top. And that, as I'm sure he can attest to, and from my time in the industry, that requires strong collaboration between what you would consider operators and clinicians. And so I think you see that in Jacob commenting on, him feeling like that it is certainly swayed towards the denial side in terms of really thinking about the kiddos and the patients getting care versus like, what is my bottom line dollar? So I just wanted to pull that, kind of paint that picture for everybody to keep in mind that somebody who is, certainly non-clinical also understands the challenges from a clinician side, even though they may not have that background. So I think that's real critical, and keeping that in perspective throughout the remainder of our conversation here. So, which coincidentally is a perfect segue to my next, that probably pans out a little bit, takes a little bigger view of your transition into the healthcare field. And when you look at the scope of your role, your previous experiences, how has maybe your outlook as a business leader changed now that you're in healthcare versus technology or the tech world?
Well, I think as a leader, I've definitely grown exponentially faster than I would in the tech world, because in order to do some of the stuff you just talked about, you have to have a very collaborative and agile leadership strategy. I mean, I think that the environment of healthcare is set up to where bad leaders fail. And in order to make it and overcome all these challenges, like the 13-step workflow I was talking about earlier, you've got to have a good team, and that team has to have good leaders. So I think that I've grown the most since transitioning into healthcare, which has coincidentally been the shortest part of my career. I guess the other part of that question was just coming from technology, and given what I've seen in the tech industry and what I've seen in the healthcare industry, I would say that there is a huge void of technology here. And I think that's slowly starting to close, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah. And what's, obviously having a feel for what type of technology exists out there, obviously maybe technology that you've used at your current company and previous companies, where do you feel like that technology can help most? What are some of those critical pieces where in your mind you go, gosh, I know this technology is out there, or I know this exists. We should just apply it here and it could become exponentially better.
Yeah, there's probably two of the most common things that I think of is Google Maps and navigation in general, and then FaceTime. And I'll talk about navigation first, specifically with me being in home health, how important this is. How many times have you used Google Maps or Apple Maps or Waze or an app like that to navigate from one point to another one, to look up information about a specific place, to link to a website? And then after you go to that place, you start getting advertisements about that place. You start getting notifications about that place. That's a really complicated and useful thing to have. And there's, I think, one electronic medical record system, or EMR, that has started integrating that into the home health scene. And I think we're about 5 years behind in that regard. I think it would make a huge difference in terms of being able to manage a patient census. You take an agency that covers 100 square mile radius, and then you give them a navigational software that integrates into their EMR and tells them where their patients are, where their cliniicians are, and you get a much more efficient agency that can help a lot more kids with the same amount of people. The second, I guess, idea that I would think of is FaceTime. We've had FaceTime, we've had video chat, we've had Skype for years now. I think that there's an application of this to some extent in the teletherapy world, but how much easier could it be think of any medical line in any home health agency. You could consolidate visits. You could, there's so much opportunity there.
Yeah. Certainly the opportunity exists, and I'm going to play devil's advocate certainly on the video chat one, in that, while the technology has existed for many years, like many other technologies, it doesn't mean it's good. And the infrastructure to implement a quality solution can be very challenging. And what I'm alluding to is that you have to think about strength of signals, right? For both whoever's on the receiving end of the call and the on side of it. And whatever platform you're using to make that call happen, whether it's a VoIP system, or now you're thinking about, oh gosh, are you using a patient data because of their cell phone or call, right, whatever it may be, right? And so, right away, those are some of the challenges that I know exist. And then just in general, but, kind of back to your point, kind of the antiquated approach a lot of times in healthcare is still just that acceptance that it is possible to have an effective visit telephonically or through video. And we know more and more every day that it is, but it's still a big hurdle to overcome. So All that being said, simply just offering kind of thoughts to the audience about some of the reasons why maybe it has not been adopted as quickly as we'd like, because we know in our personal lives we're more apt to use this type of technology, but to be able to implement it on a large scale infrastructure, you can't be dealing with poor video quality, drop signals and things like that all the time. So, just because it exists, it still needs to be good. And I think that there's a way for that there's a ways to go a little bit for it consistently to be good all the time, right? And I'm curious, backing up to your comment on Google Maps, and when you think about that integration into any agency in the market, when you say that you could pull up an integration with Google Maps and be able to see where your patients are and your providers are you paint a picture for me? Are you suggesting that you can see dots on a map to where then you can plot who can cover who, and you have a much more efficient scheduling process? Or what exactly are you alluding to?
Yeah, so it's like that, but there's also a couple other applications. For example, and the one EMR that I use that I think is probably gets it right is it has all of the patient addresses plugged in. It has all of the clinicians or providers' addresses plugged in. And so when you as a scheduler are pulling up a patient trying to schedule visits, cover shifts, insert whatever you're trying to do, it will pull up the list of clinicians for the patient in an order of geographical radius, listing the closest one first, and it goes down from there. You click on that, and then let's say as a scheduler, I want Joe to go see Lucy, and I'm just using generic names here. Well, I can actually click on Joe's name, and there will be a flip down that will paint me a picture of how they would get there, how long it would take them, what the step-by-step directions are, and their phone number. So as I'm calling Joe to have him go help out Lucy, I can guide him step by step how to get there, and I can kind of sell it to him in a way that, hey, it's very close to you, it's very easy to get to, and you have that information for every single one of your patients and every single one of your clinicians at the click of a button, as opposed to typing everything in separately.
Right. Okay. And so that's the scheduler who initially has that information, obviously making that call to that clinician, and as you said, kind of walking them through how easy it might be to get there to encourage them to want to take on that patient. And then conversely, your clinician also then has access to, if not the exact same data, some version of that data when they actually go out to complete the visit. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I think without question, the Google Map things seems very obvious when it comes to getting around any type of geographical area. It seems like that would have certainly been adopted quicker. And right away, I could think of another startup company that is doing some recruiting location-based services, I'll call them. Mm-hmm. And now that, without going too far off topic, but I always like to throw out these little tidbits to keep people wondering, I immediately think of an opportunity to take advantage of some Google Map integration with a location-based recruiting service, to how you better take advantage of those opportunities as well. Absolutely. Where based on location, you're getting very specific available job opportunities, like literally down to like this job is a half a mile from your house. It's quite an interesting technology that's growing pretty quickly. So anyway, just food for thought there. So, Jacob, did you see yourself in a healthcare career?
No, not at all. It is a strange twist of fate that I landed in healthcare. Originally, in college, I took a lot of Chinese, took a lot of business courses, and thought myself as the next international businessman, going to go tear it up in China. And then I started working in the tech industry, got a little bit discouraged at how, for lack of a better term, soulless I thought it was, and was given the opportunity to shift into healthcare, really kind of cold turkey, and took it. And since then, it's been kind of nose to the grindstone. It's been an amazing journey. I get to go to work and finally feel like I'm making a true difference in someone's life. And I really think that I am making a difference in that life. I don't just feel that way.
Yeah. And so I'll add on to that. I think it's important that for anyone involved in healthcare, certainly the clinicians play a critical component of the actual direct patient care, but it does take many hands, many bodies, many different skill sets to make it all happen, right? Those 13 steps that Jacob alluded to, and that's not just at any one company. That's a very similar story for everybody involved. That those challenges require skill sets of both clinical nature and otherwise. And so, those individuals who are not necessarily the direct patient caregivers, you should feel not only proud of what you do and the role that you play, but you should also understand that as much as your role is critical, so is the patient caregiver. And that the point of that is that you have to look at the contribution at some level equally, so you become better collaborators. In any given situation, the rules that I've always followed, I obviously, as I've said before, come from a home health background myself and in leadership roles. And Jacob has already attested to the idea of that collaboration that must occur between clinical and non-clinical, which is, each party has to enter into that relationship understanding where the responsibilities lie, and in a given decision, whose priorities outweigh the other. And inevitably, going in with that perspective and that mindset makes those individual conversations much simpler and more collaborative. Just keep those things in mind, because I think they're very critical to the success of collaborative leaders in the healthcare space. Jacob, you talked about feeling like you've been able to come over and really make a difference, and being able to really feel like you can just put your nose to the grindstone. We've obviously uncovered that doesn't come without the good and the bad of it. Can you talk a little more specifically about what you feel like some of those daily pros and cons are in the industry that you face, both as a business leader, but also just as in a general industry perspective as well?
Yeah. So I think that, general pros of the role, like I'd stated before, it is very much a rewarding career to be in. It sometimes doesn't even feel like a career. It feels like just something that I love to do. But in kind of expanding on that, I really enjoy the challenge of building and coaching a team to success. That's what I did in tech. That's what I do now. It's something that for me is personally rewarding, and I get the opportunity to come in. Everybody that we work with, typically in every real scenario that I've been in healthcare, has a very coachable mindset. Everybody wants to do better. And the better you get, the more you can see that. The more patients you are able to send clinicians out to, it's very, very rewarding. I like bringing out the best in people and helping them reach their ceiling and crashing through it. So that's something that's really awesome. Some of the cons that occur are, and this is kind of a summary of some of the stuff we talked about a little bit earlier, but the administrative workflow can be frustrating. There are times where you can do nothing. All the circumstances are completely out of your control, and you are sitting there waiting for a variety of different things. A health plan could take a week to get back to you on a treatment request. There could be a kid that goes on hold or loses Medicaid, and there's nothing that you can do. There's so many scenarios in there that are small road bumps or small obstacles that you have to overcome. And if you let them affect you too much, then, you can get discouraged. But I think that's where the team comes in. We truly do have a team mindset where I work now, and kind of lifts you up and helps you work through it.
Yeah, it certainly can be kind of weigh on your mental health a little bit in a given day, right? Because oftentimes we're in healthcare because we like to help others, and when you take away that ability or the control of being able to do that by being forced to wait through some administrative workflow or paperwork, those times can get real challenging. Nobody really wants to feel powerless in those moments, and I know that could be tough. So how has your perspective on healthcare in general changed now that you're actually in the industry?
Well, I would say that my perspective has evolved. I've got a lot more tools now than I did when I first entered to analyze what I see. I think the biggest discovery is how much opportunity there is in healthcare, whether it's from an agency standpoint, a home health standpoint, a technology standpoint. There's just a gargantuan amount of opportunity to get into the industry and help them. It's almost overwhelming at some points, but I think that healthcare is a really good place to be. It's got a long way to go, longer than I initially thought. It's slower moving than a lot of other industries, but at the end of the day, it's probably the most rewarding profession I could imagine.
Yeah, well said. Um, how do you feel like we prevent a Deshaun Morris occurrence in the future? And I know there's not one simple answer to that, but I guess the bigger question is, strip away all the politics and everything, what would kind of be your thoughts about how to quote unquote fix healthcare?
I think that transparency is lacking in the industry. I think that providers are fairly transparent with each other. Health plans are fairly transparent with each other. The government is transparent within itself. I think that when you start intersecting those three and more different segments of the business, that's where the transparency dies. I can't just dial up an insurance company and ask them even two questions. There's so much just, I guess, red tape that we have to go through before you can actually get to a real answer. I think that streamlining of the processes on all sides would be the best way to quote unquote fix healthcare.
Yeah, it's interesting as I hear talk about that, two things that come to mind. One, which is very much a cliche statement, but I think rings very true, which is knowledge is power. And the second one being something that, Jacob and I have known each other for quite some time, and he's probably heard me say this, but something I do believe wholeheartedly in is at some level, you can almost say anything you want as long as you say it the right way. And I think about those two statements when I think about this transparency that Jacob refers to, in that, a parent, a home health agency, I feel like would be significantly more understanding, or at least feel more empowered and comfortable in the situation if they had exactly what you alluded to, Jacob, is more information, right? More knowledge about understanding what's happening, why is there a delay, or whatever the scenario may be. But there's a level of comfort that comes in that versus the helplessness, right? So even if it's not the best answer, or maybe the answer or outcome you were looking for, if you had better information up front, there's likely a better outcome, at least in how you deal with it as a parent or as a patient. And I feel like that maybe is a big answer, or a big challenge in that. And I think when you look at the Deshaun Morris story, you certainly got a feel for that. When for those of you who listened yesterday, you'll recognize this. But also, if you look up the story after this episode, you'll see that Deshaun's mother and a person from the agency that was caring for Deshaun were inadvertently sent a conference call line and participated on what was supposed to be a private call internally inside of Superior. And so you had two individual outsiders getting a firsthand experience with how they are, quote unquote, spoke about behind closed doors. And it's quite eye-opening the way that, they simply just don't respect the individuals who are party to that conversation, right? Or who are a part of that conversation. In that, I'm going to stop right there and encourage you guys to go listen to it for yourself, because the words that are used are pretty alarming, but also paint that picture for why that lack of transparency likely exists, because they use it as a form of control and power to maximize profits or regulate their own policies, whatever term you want to put in there. But there's some reasons behind it, to say the least. So that was kind of a long elaboration there, Jacob. But when you talk about that transparency, would you agree with that concept of, is that what you're referring to, kind of that front end information where if we did a better job sharing across all platforms as far as the stakeholders are concerned, patient, agency, provider, physician, all that we would have much better progress and much better outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's a very good elaboration on the concept that I was thinking of. Mm-hmm.
By very good, you certainly mean a very long elaboration?
No, it was good. It was good. It gave a lot more detail to what I was thinking of in my head. So no, it was very well put. Transparency between all parties is great. And the other thing that kind of came to mind when you were talking about that is that it's a challenge right now because there's so many different layers to healthcare, to all aspects of healthcare. I think reducing that amount is the first challenge. And as a parent, I wouldn't even know where to start.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It's, as I said in the opening, without question, the one thing we can answer today is that we know that there's no easy solution and there's no easy answer to what oftentimes can be very heartbreaking situations. But our hope today, as Jacob and I discussed preparing for this episode and having this episode, was that we both agreed that if nothing else, we wanted awareness out of this. And so hopefully, hearing things like the story about Deshaun, hearing things like 13 steps to get somebody into care, 30 days, 45 days, the lack of technology that's being integrated and used in day-to-day operations and day-to-day patient care. All of those things hopefully are bringing awareness to an understanding from both sides of, if you are in the industry trying to create some urgency to make change, but then if you're also a family member or a parent or somebody who has somebody in care, that you are also conscious of the internal challenges on the other side. I know it's likely more difficult for them because there's an emotional component to it that's much deeper, but the challenges are very real on both sides. And as again, as interpretive as the black and white scenario may be with this Deshaun Morris situation, there are components that, as somebody who's been in healthcare going on 15 years, that you can at least make some foundational validation for why certain decisions were made. Again, certainly not suggesting that that's the perfect example and that it should be black and white, but the point is that taking a step back and understanding perspective overall, I think, is very critical going forward, not only in a specific situation like Deshaun, but also all future considerations in healthcare in general. So that's my soapbox, and I appreciate your time, Jacob. Any final thoughts that you'd like to close with before we close up here?
Yeah, I know you've alluded to it several times in the podcast today, but I would also like to encourage everybody to look up the Pain and Profit study. It's a 6-part, I believe, a series of articles that covers this story. It's very, very enlightening, and it gives you a really, really good overview of some of the stuff that we talked about.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. The Dallas Morning News and the reporters in that, kudos to you. You really did your due diligence. As you'll hear again from yesterday, they spent, I think, nearly a year, a little over a year on the story, something upwards of 70,000 documents, many hundreds of interviews, is what they quoted. So they certainly did their due diligence in pulling together some real perspective. So I second Jacob's notion that you use yesterday's episode, our conversation today, and go do some research. The information is available to you to really understand what's out there and what challenges are being faced, and then form your own reality around it. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.